Welcome to Captain America's Greatest Writers. My name is Grant, and I run the social media channel Cap Facts, where a few times a week I share facts about Captain America, and I'm obsessed with the man, which is why I speak about him at every top opportunity I get.
I'm Jason Olsen. I teach at Utah State University. I'm an associate professor of English. I'm making sure we're mentioning Utah State University because they're helping me with funding for this. So go Aggies. I am a writer, and I've written a couple of books about Mark Gruenwald's work, including about Captain America, and we'll talk about that today. And I just have one that just came out about his work on a comic called Quasar, which came out in the late 80s and ran until 1994. Which I promised my two friends that I would not talk about Quasar much in this conversation because we're talking about Captain America, but it might split out.
You're allowed one slide about it.
Oh, okay.
As you may have guessed, we are not, in fact, the three greatest Captain America writers. We are going to be talking about those writers, so just please stay if you're putting something else. My name is Matthew Glover. I'm a practicing attorney. I also write for the Cover Price website, and I am fortunate to have such good friends that will come and talk to me, and I'm grateful for everybody coming to hear us talk about Captain America.
That's heartfelt. That's very nice. Yeah.
So talk a little bit about why we picked these three writers. So in the 80 plus years that Captain America, since his inception, there have been over 800 issues written with 46 different writers total, yet 40% of those over 800 issues were written just by three guys. And so, they've clearly had a big impact on the Captain America mythos and what he means today. So we're going to start off with Stan the Man Lee, who's probably the most well-known comic creator in the world. Like, I would normally joke about my mom recognizing him even, but I am her kid, so of course she recognizes him. And Stan Lee is famous for co-creating a number of famous characters such as Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, the Hulk. But what's funny is with Captain America, things are a bit reversed in that Captain America is responsible for the creation of Stan Lee. See, Stan Lee isn't the writer's birth name, which is instead Stanley Martin Lieber. And growing up, he had great dreams of one day writing the great American novel. And so after graduating high school, he got the chance to work at the publishing company of Timely Comics. And he figured this would be a good chance to get some experience writing. And he started off as an assistant to the two lead employees at Timely Comics. Timely would eventually go on to be rebranded as Marvel. And he was the assistant to the two lead employees, Joe Simon and Jack Kirby. And at first, his duties were the kind of traditional assistant duties of fetching coffee and lunch, refilling inkwells, erasing pencil lines, and the like. But he did pretty early on get the chance to do some writing, because in order to be classified as magazines, which got a better shipping rate, comics had to have 2 pages that were mostly text. And so the standard practice at the time was to have a 2-page text story in the middle of it to qualify for that rate. And since Joe Simon and Jack Kirby were busy creating the rest of the comic pages, doing the art and whatnot, they asked Stan if he would like to do the text story for Captain America Comics issue number 3. And excited to get that experience and that writing work, he agreed to do it. But he was a little nervous about it because at the time, comics were not a well-respected medium. So he wanted to kind of preserve his real name for his novel One Day and other serious works. And so the text story, Captain America Foils the Betrayer's Revenge, has the pen name Stan Lee on it. And it's kind of wild to think about that, where he's so well known by Stan Lee now, where that was meant to be a temporary name. And in fact, he eventually had to legally change his name because it was causing issues, where he'd be booked for a speaking event, and when he would go to check into the hotel they booked for him, it'd be booked under Stan Lee, and then he chose license and it'd say Stanley Lieber, so they wouldn't let him in. So going back to these early days at Timely, he continued doing those text stories and even got to write some of the shorter comic stories for the period of about a year, when there was a big change up at Timely, where Joe Simon and Jack Kirby were booted out and left nobody else to run the company, run all the stories. And so the owner of Timely Comics, Martin Goodman, he put Stan temporarily in charge of the comics while he searched out a replacement. And this was a big workload. Stan was only 19 and yet was given this big workload of being the lead writer and art editor and editor-in-chief of this comics division. And this temporary assignment ended up only being slightly less temporary than his pen name. He would hold the position of editor-in-chief for over 40 years until he went on to other positions at Marvel. Now, I did list, he was in 3 big roles at the company, and so this was a lot of work for one person. And so in order to help manage that and put out a decent set of comics each month, they developed something called the Marvel Method, which is where basically Stan would work with the artist to make a basic outline for each story. But then the artist would kind of be given rein to fill in any of those gaps while they drew all the pages and had a lot of control over the pacing and even character introductions. And then once they were done with the art, they would take it back to Stan, who would then fill in the caption and dialogue and sometimes make changes to what they had initially put. And because of this, it can be a little difficult to recognize for sure what was done by Stan versus the artist. But as we go through, there's enough that seems to be consistent across different artists and different themes that keep popping up that we can pick out a few things that are likely Stan's work specifically. Now, as we got into the 60s and Timely had rebranded into Marvel Comics, there was a push to bring back Captain America, as his previous title from the 40s had been canceled years earlier. And so they wanted to bring him back, but they couldn't bring him back just as he had been in those early World War II issues, because the Captain America of the 40s was a much flatter, straightforward character than the other characters that were being introduced at this time, like Spider-Man and the X-Men, who had real-world problems and flaws. And so the question was, what kind of real-world problems do you give Captain America? And it seems that what they settled on were to tap into those origins from World War II and give him a lot of the same issues that veterans had been facing ever since the war ended. Stan Lee and many in the Marvel bullpen had served in World War II. And even if they didn't have those specific issues that we're going to talk about Cap having, they would have seen those in their friends and family who were in that same demographic of having gone through World War II.
And Grant, the thing that's fascinating to me is if Captain America went into the ice in the 1940s, at the end of World War II, and he came out when this came out, it was about 20 years after the war. If you do that today, that means Captain America would have come out post 9/11, which I think is really fascinating. But please continue.
I'm so old.
Now, so the main thing that we can see that Cap has in common with those World War II veterans is in these early issues, Captain America is clearly suffering from some level of PTSD. They don't call it that. At the time, the term was battle fatigue. But even as early as World War II, it was getting more and more recognized as a serious issue amongst those who served in the military. In 1945, there was a study, and it said that there were 314,000 medical discharges for psychiatric reasons, which was 43% of all medical discharges. And more than just the sheer number of people that they were recognizing with these issues, it was getting recognized more and more that battle fatigue wasn't due to the weakness of individual soldiers, but instead something that would happen to pretty much anyone with prolonged exposure to what they were getting exposed to. John Appel, who was a psychiatrist during World War II, said practically all men in rifle battalions who are not otherwise disabled ultimately become psychiatric casualties. And the main symptom that Cap shows of this PTSD is depression. Cap is super depressed during a lot of these issues. He will have full pages where he is wondering about his purpose in life and moaning about the loss of his wartime allies, such as Bucky Barnes, who was his teenage sidekick during World War II.
We're gonna talk about that.
Yeah, he supposedly died in the same accident that put Captain Ice, but he'd be revived later, but that would happen 40 years later. So
Skips over me.
yeah, and so he dealt with that a lot, and some other wartime allies that he lost. And with these depressive episodes, it became so frequent and so character defining that both in the comic pages and even in letters that were sent to the comics, he would get referred to sometimes as the modern day Hamlet. And this comparison to Shakespeare is pretty accurate, like with some of the characterization they give Steve Rogers. Stan Lee grew up reading a lot of Shakespeare, and that influence is very clear in some of the monologues that Steve Rogers has during these issues. So just look at this sequence of panels from Tales of Suspense number 75. All my life, I've tried to find a place for Steve Rogers, but still he lives under the more colorful shadow of Captain America. Perhaps it's Steve Rogers who's the legend, and Captain America who's the reality. Perhaps I was born to be a red, white, and blue Avenger, and nothing more. But there must be more to life than endless combat. Others have found a home, a family. Why can't I? Or is Steve Rogers destined to walk alone forever, until the final battle, until he walks no more? To be or not to be? That is the question. You know, the only thing missing is it's not in iambic pentameter. I did check. And this distinction, or this is a clear distinction between the revived Captain America and the Captain America of the 40s. There's some issues that are flashbacks to the early days of World War II. And that version of Steve Rogers is far more upbeat and happy. In these issues, there's no monologues wondering about his purpose in life, and he hadn't really lost anybody yet other than Professor Erskine, who gave him the serum. But instead, you know, this is a jovial, happy Captain America who's palling around with Bucky while blowing up Nazis. And so there's just a clear distinction between Steve in the war and after the war. Something else that Steve had in common with these World War II veterans was a need for action. And granted, these are superhero comics, so action is an essential element. But it goes a bit farther with Steve, where anytime he has any sort of free time in the comics, he's either moping about his troubles or seeking out trouble. And this was something that would happen to a lot of veterans who were on the front lines. The real or regular life just became dull in comparison. And many of them became adrenaline junkies, just seeking out thrills to get their hearts racing again. There was one veteran who in an interview said, "I did anything that was dangerous. I would go to the toughest sections of New York. One night, a gunfight erupted in a nightclub in Greenwich Village. As I was going to that club, I climbed up on steps to watch it. I was sad when the cops got there and broke it up. Other friends with me were under cars, and I thought it was the greatest thing I saw since the war ended, you know?" So with Steve, he is just on the constant lookout for action and adventure. And it's not even out of like an altruistic desire to help people. He's just in desperate need of something to distract him from his day-to-day life. Something that's not related to the war or PTSD is just the disconnect that Steve has with modern day trends. Like he's confused by modern day fashion and doesn't like the new car designs they have, which feels like the most old man, back in my day type of mentality that I've ever heard. And this is just something that happens to a lot of people as they get older. You know, Stan Lee was getting into his 40s at this time. And I don't know about the rest of you, but I'm not quite that old. But there's just things that I can even see in my life where things are different than I was younger, and it kind of feels like I'm in a totally different world. Like when I go to a restaurant, I don't want to scan a QR code. Just give me a physical menu. You know, in another 10 years, I'm sure I'll be just as much of a curmudgeon.
Grant, is that your old man rant?
That is my old man.
Okay.
That's one of them.
Okay.
I have many.
And you give me the side eye on this, and you start ranting
I
about
was
QR
looking at
codes.
both of you, so we're just closer. And then the last thing we're going to look at for Stan Lee has to do with Steve's romantic relationship at the time with Sharon Carter. With these two, there is not a lot of the tropes that you'll see in other romances in fiction. Like, there's no question of whether or not they like each other. They're both head over heels for each other. During this time, there's not anyone else trying to weasel their way in, nobody is a romantic rival. But what is getting in the way is Sharon's job. She is a member of S.H.I.E.L.D., a peacekeeping organization, and for some reason, this makes it difficult for them to be together. You might think that there would be a concern for her safety, but that gets mentioned like once or twice, but overall, the concern is just her dedication to S.H.I.E.L.D., as though working for them means she can't have a normal relationship. And this seems to be rooted in some of the concerns that were being had at the time with women in the workforce. Prior to World War II, a lot of women would drop out of the workforce once they got married, and that started changing during and after World War II. So specifically, there was a study done with nurses where in the 1920s, only 20% of nurses would be married on average. And then when we got into 1949, it rose to 42%. And then when we get to 1966, which is kind of the time period that a lot of these issues were being written, it had gone up to 66%. And some people weren't happy with this change in the labor force. So James O'Connell, who was the Undersecretary of Labor in 1960, gave the following quote: "When a woman comes to be viewed first as a source of manpower, second as a mother, then I think we are losing much that supposedly separates us from the communist world. The highest calling of a woman's sex is the home." And so while Steve is generally supportive of Sharon's career, though it does cause issues a lot, it is the main thing that is a conflict in the relationship clear through Stan's total time on the title of Captain America. And that ended in 1971 when Stan Lee was just getting too much work and couldn't keep up writing. And so he did continue as the editor on Captain America up until 1972. But at that point, he was promoted to be publisher at Marvel, and so he stopped working on the day-to-day operations in general. And he was on the title for a long time, and while we could have looked at a number of the colorful villains that were created during that time, like Batroc the Leaper, or MODOK, or my favorite, the Tumbler, in reality, the real struggles and issues that Captain America had were the same as those that were being had by a number of World War II veterans.
I don't think you can do a presentation without bringing up the Tumblr.
I cannot.
I wrote a book about Quasar.
That's one.
So I want to talk next about Mark Gruenwald. Mark Gruenwald is the writer from 1985 to 1995. That's a really long time. That's 10 years. And between Stan and Mark's runs on Captain America, there were 26 writers on this comic. That's an average. I did the math. I'm an English professor, but I did math for you. That's an average of 6 issues per writer for those 163. Gruenwald wrote 137. There were a couple of very, very good writers during that run. There's no question about that. But what Mark did to stabilize the character is crucial for the continuing success of the character up to this day. I broke this down into the 3 C's for Mark Gruenwald's run. It's consequential, it's character building, and continuity. Mark is known as the continuity guru of the Marvel Universe. He knew everything. If somebody had a question about what character appeared in what issue and what Machine Man issue did this character debut in, Mark knew it. There wasn't Google then, you didn't need it at Marvel. You could Gruenwald it, and that worked just fine. So I want to start with consequential, because this is a big run. It's not just important in terms of length, it's important in terms of what happens over the course of this run, because there are major storylines that impact the MCU and Marvel Comics to this day. He creates new and impactful villains that challenge Cap's ideology, and he also gives us some social and political commentary that kind of continues some of the stuff that Grant was talking about too. So he went into that first year on Captain America with a plan, and he needed to bulk up Captain America's rogues gallery because he didn't think it was very interesting. And in fairness, there were some great villains in there, but there were a whole bunch of Nazis. And it's 85 now, and done with that. And so
Indiana Jones has that covered.
exactly. And so what he wanted to do was make sure that he brought in new villains that were going to give Captain America some other challenge to look at. And so these were villains that served as ideological counterpoints for Cap. And here are a few notable ones that come up right away. In the first year, we get Super Patriot. He's kind of important. He's going to come up later. You might not recognize him from that costume, but this is John Walker, who will eventually become Captain America during Gruenwald's run, and eventually become more famous as the U.S. agent, who is relevant in the MCU to this day in Thunderbolts. And unrelated, I'll be talking about Thunderbolts on a panel right after this one. That's my one plug for that right now.
First, you're plugging your book and your
Why else would I be here? The next one that we see there is Flag Smasher, and Flag Smasher was anti-nationalist. So he provided this really interesting contrast to Captain America's patriotism by showing somebody who believes that maybe we shouldn't have any borders and we should live as one world. There's a little violence that goes along with this message that does not make him a hero, but the message is interesting. In the same way, the Super Patriot creates this aggressive form of patriotism that is not what Captain America preaches. Then we have Sidewinder. He represents the Serpent Society, which is a labor union of supervillains. His main priority is money, as he says in one of my favorite panels. Money. It's nice when your villains just let you know what their objective is. And this scary fellow here at the end is Scourge, and he represents vigilantism, which is running rampant by the time we get to the 80s in comics, where a lot of superheroes are vigilantes and practicing very violent methods. And here we get a lot of characters that contrast with Cap, because Cap and the Punisher have a much different view of things. Also, there were plenty of relevant social and political topics that went on during this run. There was a storyline called The Streets of Poison that dealt with substance use disorder. One of the most interesting aspects of this was one of Cap's employees, Fabian Stankiewicz, becomes hooked on a substance. And Cap goes to him and is talking about his substance use disorder. And he turns to Cap and he says, well, what about the super soldier serum? Isn't that a drug? And Cap's response is, that's different. That's different. And this was a storyline that came about because of a reader letter that asked this question, like, isn't Captain America kind of on a drug? And so this was an exploration of that character and getting to that. Violence in America just overall, we talked about the vigilantism. Also emerging use of technology. In that first year, not only was Gruenwald giving us new villains, he was also giving us the Captain America hotline, where there was a phone number that people could call if they had problems, and Cap would come to your town and solve them. Fortunately, they were all legit, so it all worked out.
We've had no problems ever since.
He also turned into a wolf at one point. And I don't know if that's super relevant to social issues, but it's cool. So there it is.
Don't you hate when you wake up one morning as a wolf?
What I love about it is even when he's a wolf, he's still Steve Rogers. He's like Steve Rogers as a wolf, making sure that everybody's where they need to be. It's fantastic. The most consequential storyline is The Captain, where Steve Rogers gives up the role of Captain America and is replaced by John Walker, who, as I said before, he not only represented negative aspects of patriotism, he was really, really violent. And in the the Falcon Winter Soldier series, there's that scene where he really does bad things with the shield. Pretty graphic in the comic too when that happens, and so it shows us that it isn't just about the title, it's about the person wearing the suit, and that's what makes Steve Rogers so special, and Gruenwald got that. The character building aspect is important because he really wanted to make Captain America a character. Stan Lee set up a lot of stuff that made him so much more than that one-dimensional World War II hero. But he also is evolving from where he was with Stan. He on Gruenwald's run, he wants to establish him as an Avenger first and Steve Rogers second, which is different than some of the things that were going on before. But in this run, Captain America moves out of his apartment, he moves into the Avengers mansion and changes a lot of the ways that he's presenting himself. He introduces Diamondback as a love interest. Sharon is dead at this point, and it's so sad. These people that die just never ever come back. And at this point, we get Diamondback, who is a love interest, who is a villain, who tries to reform because Steve is such a great guy. And he just also evolves Captain America over the course of the run. He's a man out of time. We talk about that. But in this run, he's not the angry old man yelling at clouds. He is a guy who's trying to figure out what his place is in the 80s and 90s. Now, by the end of the run, he gets a little disenchanted with things. But here, he is at a Farm Aid type event recognizing Tina Turner. And that's a very timely reference in 1986, just so everyone knows. And he continues to show Steve as somebody dealing with depression. There's one issue 401, that is pretty much focused on his depression after coming back from a mission that didn't go as well as he wanted it to, that didn't go with the Avengers all working together. And we see Steve here trying to, he wanted to have a discussion about ethics, and only 3 Avengers showed up, and they were the 3 that he didn't need to have there. And so he's sad. And Cap is sad occasionally. He also just loves training. This is a very important trait. This is one of my favorite panels ever. Star Fox has this super awkward power of, I don't even like to talk about it, but he can penetrate your pleasure centers to make you feel really good about things. It's so awful. And so he tries to do this to Captain America during a training exercise. And it's supposed to distract you, and you then no longer fight. But Captain America keeps fighting even better. And Star Fox is like, what is happening? I'm tapping into your pleasure center. And Cap's like, I love to train. So there's no time that makes me happier.
Star Fox.
Yeah, it's hard. This is Diamondback. She, as I said, she's starts as a villain. She tries to reform to crime fighting because she's very interested in Captain America. And she's a really interesting character who plays a significant role throughout this run. And she kind of follows in a trope of Cap having a lot of super villains who reform to the Avenger side or the good side. And so she really represents a lot of the characters that followed this trope in the past, including Hawkeye, the Scarlet Witch, all sorts of them who would end up in the Avengers at times. But by the end, as I said, he's getting frustrated because Gruenwald's getting frustrated. Comics in the 90s were not something we can get into in great detail today, but it was a mess. And if we want to talk about it, come talk to me sometime. But Gruenwald was having frustrations about the evolution of the industry, so was Cap. And this is a panel in issue 425 where he catches a kid stealing Captain America comics, and he stops the kid, and then he tries to give them back to the comic shop owner, and the kid doesn't want to read comics, he just wants to steal them because they're going to be worth so much. And then he talks to the comic shop owner and says, like, well, you read them, right? And he's like, yeah, I love reading them, especially Punisher and Wolverine. Oh, I'd like to slash somebody's face. And so Steve Rogers is like, I don't know where I fit into this. And Gruenwald was certainly feeling the same way. Finally, continuity. He was the continuity guru of the Marvel Universe, as I said before. There was no character too small to bring in. He was dedicated to making sure the pieces of the stories fit together. I already used my one Quasar reference, but there's a lot of that that he did in that run. I just wanted to show one panel that I thought was really cool. This is an issue in which Captain America needs to be turned into a teenager so he can infiltrate a camp. That's all I'm telling you about that. But in order to do this, I mean, look, Cap's practical. He needs to find a sorcerer who could turn him into a teenager. So in order to do that, he goes through the Avengers files to find somebody. And in this panel, I love this panel because this is a direct shot from the official handbook of the Marvel Universe, which was a comic series that Gruenwald wrote and edited. And so this is just Cersei's entry, and he just drops it right into the page. So he's constantly weaving in his universe together. It's still seen as one of the most important runs and one of the best. It's in an era of violent anti-heroes. Gruenwald Steve Rogers is a beacon of decency. And this is looked at as the highlight of Gruenwald's career. Gruenwald died very young in the 90s. This was the first line of his obituary, was his run on Captain America. And it's something we feel today.
And he was cremated, and
He was. One of his wishes in his will was to be cremated and put into the issues of a comic book. So his ashes were put into a printing press, and the Squadron Supreme trade paperback, when it first came out, it's got some Gruenwald in it. Can we reach?
I think so.
Watch this laptop float over to me. Alright. So I'm real curious. Is anybody active reader of comics? Like, okay. So about half. Has anybody never read a comic book before? Just one guy.
Okay. Let's point her out too. She looked shamed. So let's make everyone.
Thank you for being here. You've probably learned a lot today. All right, so I'm going to be talking about Ed Brubaker. So Ed Brubaker has a really interesting run. He comes in at a very interesting time. Ed grows up reading the comics that these two gentlemen have already talked about. So he saw these.
We wrote them.
Yeah, these gentlemen wrote. So he has a very different perspective than some of these other writers who come on and done these a little bit differently. His run is characterized by a couple of main events. So one, the return of a character that we'll talk about, and then kind of some retconning, some things that happen. It's a comic that's written after 9/11. It's not directly after, but there are clearly a lot of themes that were happening in the early 2000s that really influenced his run and kind of some of the things that he wanted to talk about and things he wanted to address. He killed Captain America, so that ended Captain America comic books forever, and we never talk about them anymore, as you might assume. And then this run, like the other ones, had a really clear influence on the MCU. In fact, the Captain America: The Winter Soldier there's a lot of elements that are taken directly from this run, as well as Civil War. So this character that comes back, it's Bucky Barnes, right? So as we talked about, Bucky always represented this ghost of World War II for Steve. And periodically, every writer would have what we call the Bucky issue, where Steve would go, oh, I wish that I could have done more to have saved Bucky, or I wish he made the sacrifice, and I'm here and he's not. What kind of life would he have led if it hadn't been for running around with me? So Steve always carried a lot of the guilt as it related to Bucky. And as you read Captain America comics, he was a sidekick. Like he was always portrayed as a younger kid, which is weird. You don't take 14-year-olds into combat in World War II.
I do.
We're gonna call CPS. So that was always a weird thing, and Brubaker kind of had an issue with that. So when he takes over this run, he goes to Marvel editorial and he says, hey, I want to bring back Bucky Barnes. And editorial says, no, heck no, because there were two characters you couldn't bring back. You guys know who these two are?
Uncle Ben.
Yeah, Uncle Ben. Uncle Ben never comes back from the dead. If you do that, then the great power comes, great retcons, right? and Bucky. And so they basically throw Ed, when he does his pitch out of the office, they think about it, they go, okay, well, tell us more. And so he eventually convinces editorial to let him do this. And so as you all know, I'm assuming, Bucky's brought back as a brainwash tool of the Soviets. Well, that gets interesting with the end of the Soviet Union. So Bucky goes from, as he says in the MCU, one fight to the next. When you look at Steve and Bucky's journey to where they ended up, they are often mirrors of each other. Steve goes into the ice at the end of World War II, comes out, becomes an Avenger, and proceeds to kind of continue the fight and do what he's doing. Bucky, on the other hand, similarly goes in the ice, gets brainwashed, and becomes a tool to tilt political assassinations, to tilt politics, to become a tool of the Soviets to fight the United States. And when that ends, he's used again in that ways. So the story, his arc kicks off with the Red Skull getting his hands on the Cosmic Cube, which goes back to some great Stan Lee stories, and he gets assassinated by an unknown assailant. As time reveals out, we find out it's, of course, the Winter Soldier.
Is that the first time we mentioned the Red Skull in this?
Is it?
Yes.
Yes.
Wow.
Okay, it's like the boogeyman. If we say it 2 more times. And so, bringing Bucky back creates this really complex set of emotions for Steve. Because here's a brainwashed assassin doing all these things that Cap has to stop, but it's Bucky, and all that guilt and remorse is behind it. He's got to make these decisions, and it compromises Cap as a character, Steve as a character, because he has to break with some of his heartfelt beliefs, these virtues that he's always endorsed, because of how unique this opponent is. So it creates for this really interesting run. Has anybody read the Winter Soldier arc? Couple of people. If you haven't, it's in like 300 different versions of trades and paperbacks. Pick it up, you won't regret it. And eventually, spoiler alert, Bucky becomes Captain America after Steve is assassinated. So it's well, it was a little longer than 2 weeks, but he does pick it up. Okay, so talking about the era this comic becomes up. This is a post 9/11 world. The initial run that occurred right after 9/11 was under the Marvel Knights imprint. It does involve some very direct references because the United States was going through a very specific, very emotional state, and the comics somehow needed to reflect this. But in order to do that, they brought some different ideas, and in the meantime, Ed comes up with his pitch. It's about 2 or 3 years after 9/11 that we're dealing with the global war on terror. We have the Patriot Act, and so if you've read Civil War by Mark Millar, it's a great metaphor to be discussing liberties and freedoms and surveillance and these things. So this comic really comes between the going to war in Iraq, the Patriot Act, things are happening in the United States, and it's a pre-social media window. Facebook and social media are just starting. Zuckerberg's kind of doing this thing. So it's this really unique time capsule for telling Cap stories. So they took a different tone. Rather than being the soldier or the superhero, Cap kind of takes this spy thriller. It's a little bit darker of a story, and you see that reflected in its art as well. So we talked about trust in the government, growing tensions about privacy, what this was all supposed to be about. Okay. And then the art was done by Steve Epting. So somehow in doing this, I was like, oh yes, Mr. Steve Epstein. I was like, oh no. Well, fortunately, Grant caught that one for me. So
I thought it was a reference I didn't get. I was excited to learn.
So Steve does, Epting does quite a bit for the art cover, and I'm just going to go through some of these. Clearly, it's still Captain America. The wings on his head, the colors, the shield, the stripes, but he takes a much more muted approach with the colors. This is what Bucky ends up looking like, and you'll notice from the waist down, Bucky's always worn in black. He wears combat boots, he carries a sidearm, because Bucky's approach to combat and what he did as the Winter Soldier and what his capacity is very different than Steve's. And to kind of compensate for that, his chest piece is made out of, I believe it's adamantine, or a form of it. I don't actually remember. So yeah, it's an adamantine chest piece because he fights differently, but it shines. And so I think it's interesting when you compare those two. Steve, he's got this, the swashbuckler boots. It's very rare for Steve to shoot a gun at his enemies. The shield. Bucky, that's what he does. And in fact, they were getting ready to go on a mission, and Bucky's handing out guns. And Spider-Man's like, why are you doing this? And said, don't you want a gun? Like, it's just how he addresses things. And clearly there's some dark, the government being involved in different things. S.H.I.E.L.D. here is kind of depicted. Very interesting run. I think Epting was a great pick for this time and the overall tone. And it creates an interesting character for Bucky. He goes from the psycho, and this is one of the things that Brubaker does in this run. Rather than Bucky being the little kid, that was kind of the myth that was sold to the public. Because you can't have Cap, climbing up the sewer and garroting Nazis in their sleep. That's kind of not his role. Bucky doesn't have that issue. He goes, okay, yeah, we can do that. So he was much more into the wet work. He was retconned to be an operator, a fighter like that. And so I think it was really interesting this run that Steve dies and then they bring Bucky into his role. Speaking of Cap dying during the assassination, during Civil War, he's assassinated. And I remember distinctly when this happened because it felt like a weird turning point in our country. Because Captain America, this individual that's kind of oftentimes a representation of the American dream, not one party or the other, was killed. And it caught headline news. It was really interesting. When they did that, Marvel editorial said, okay, I don't know if anyone's ever read comics, but people die a lot in comics and they come back. It's the great like soap opera that runs and runs. Editorial said, okay, look, if you're gonna do this, make it count. And so his death had a great weight on comics for a long time. And they did The Fallen Sun, and I just really liked that issue. But, you know, he came back. So we talk about Steve, talk about Bucky's death. So Bucky stays in the uniform, stays Captain America, and is eventually killed by Sin, who is the daughter of the Red Skull. That's two. Okay, and violently so. This is in the Matt Fraction Fear Itself. And you look at that coming out of the run, there was a lot of fear in the United States and fear of things that were going on in the world. Sin basically at one point rips his arm off and beats Bucky to death with it. Up to this point, Steve had said, I don't want to come back and take up the mantle. Bucky's doing a good job. This is good therapy for him. And this is the event that puts Steve back in uniform, or one of the events that does. JK. And then this frees Bucky to go on to kind of do his own stuff. Obviously, the MCU adopted a lot of this, the look, feel, the complexity of the character. In fact, there's the scene where they're in the bank lobby where Robert Redford, rest in power, they're brainwashing Bucky, right? They put the mouth guard in him, they start zapping his brain again. One of the scientists in there is, in fact, Mr. Ed Brubaker. So he got to have his own little cameo in the movie. So talk about like an immediate influence on the film.
And Mark Gruenwald has been dead since the 90s, so he did not make any appearances in the MCU. But on Loki, you know, the Owen Wilson character that has a mustache, character totally based on Mark Gruenwald. The character of Mobius was based on Mark, and Owen grew the mustache out because Mark had a mustache. And it was interesting because there was a time in which Owen, sorry, he's not that good. He didn't embody the character that much, but Owen Wilson was interviewed and said, I had to grow a mustache out for this part. And then he got a text the next day from an unknown number that said strike one. So Marvel, very protective, I guess, of their secrets. So evidently the mustache was his secret, yeah.
So it's a great run. I've really enjoyed Mr. Brubaker's stuff on it. There's some great runs that have come since and before, but those are just some ones we wanted to highlight for you guys today. We've got about 15 minutes left.
Don't we end at 50?
I think we ended 15.
So we got like 5 minutes.
5 minutes.
Okay.
We're taking questions. If you got a question, step up to the microphone. We'll be happy to answer them.
And Matthew will be hanging out right outside for the 10 minutes after that.
I'll talk cap with you way out. So, any questions? Yes, right up to the mic.
Well, he's got a sleeping child on him.
Oh, and it's forgiven, but you go first.
Okay, well, I guess since we're talking about influential captain runs, we have the most recent one. What are your thoughts on the Chip Zdarsky run so far?
Love it. I'll go first.
Yeah, go first.
I'm really enjoying Chip's run. I knew it was going to be good. And kind of like as I alluded to during Grant's Porter's presentation, the Marvel has a sliding timeline, right? Because if we didn't, like Mr. Fantastic would be like 80 years old. So like they just kind of slide to make the story work. In order to make the story work today, you go back 20 years, 9/11's already happened. So this Steve Rogers that Chip Zdarsky's writing is a Captain America that wasn't there to stop it. He wasn't there to help those people. He wasn't there to fight in the global war on terror. So I find this cap to be really interesting because it puts him as this really unique man out of time, where I've been around from things that he hasn't, which is it's new for me.
Any thoughts? Exactly. I haven't read as much of it as I want to because I was writing this book over here, so I kind of had to hide away. But what I have seen and looked at, it sounds great.
Yeah, I mean, he kind of said it all, where we're early enough in the run that it's hard to judge it as a whole run.
Yeah.
But like, I'm intrigued and I'm excited each time the issue comes out, so I'm hoping it's a really good run and it's set up to be that way.
And I will get there.
Yeah.
What do you?
Mine's more of like a personal opinion. So we have the Secret Empire run, and of course what happened a little bit before that. So
Which
I kind
Secret
of,
Empire run?
well, the one where Steve will.
Okay.
Okay.
Right. So I guess I want to know what your guys' personal opinions when it comes to the writing when Steve, not only picked up Mjolnir's hammer by faking this out and saying Hail Hydra, but saying it for the first time, but meaning it, and kind of what your guys' emotions. Because I remember when we were talking about it, our kind of whole world stopped, and we had to just sit there and stare out the window as it rained a little bit to be like, are
I
we
should have
okay?
said Bucky, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so for those of you that are kind of a little context, there's a secret Empire story where a cosmic cube turned Steve into an agent of Hydra. And so that was a shocking issue in the first Captain America where he says, Hail Hydra.
It was all over.
It was all over the news. It was a really interesting story. And so our question is kind of, how did we take that? How did we perceive that? So I'll let you guys go.
It was shocking at first, but I kept reminding myself it's comics, and they kept saying this, this will change everything forever. But it's like it's comics, it's comics, it's comics. And ultimately, it's a pretty good storyline. I enjoy the story. I think it works well. It was a swing, but as we've talked about, sometimes big swings get made. A lot of people got mad about it, and I think a lot of the people that got the most mad didn't read it because I think the storyline actually worked pretty well.
Yeah. Like, I wasn't consistently reading comics when it came out, and so I did see the headlines, but I thought something like, okay, this will be changed relatively quickly. But it did go on longer than I expected. It was like a year plus. But so because of that, I didn't read it until it had already come out. So I was able to view it more as an extended what if kind of storyline. And I think in that context, it is a really interesting story, especially to see how Steve Rogers still shines through even when he's evil. Like, he's clearly struggling with some of the things he has to do. He just thinks it's still the right thing. It's just a very different take on the character, and I like seeing that side of him. But I can see why some people don't like it.
Yeah.
Sure.
But I do agree. I think a lot of the people who are upset about it read that single panel and then probably didn't even read the next issue where they clearly state what's going on.
Yeah.
So
I think we really got to see him shine as a tactician in
Right.
True.
how dangerous he is
True.
at the end of the day. Because if he wanted to, he could take over the U.S. like that.
yeah.
So to your point, Steve Rogers is a brilliant strategist. He's a brilliant tactician. He's an incredible soldier. You put those things together, you have to have somebody who can do all those things, and that's kind of rare. Who better to fight Captain America than a Captain America who doesn't have qualms with his moral compass? And that's kind of how we got that.
Yeah.
So I think we're getting the signal that we gotta be done. So I mean, me and you will be probably available after to talk more. You've got to run to another
And
panel.
you can follow me, I think, across the hall where I'm going to talk about the Thunderbolts movie, and maybe Bucky will come up.
Yeah, but
and yeah.
yeah. So
We'll see.
quick plug before we end. Again, my name is CapFacts on most social media that you can check out if you want to see more from me.
My book is available on Amazon, or you can come talk to me, although again, I'm running across the hall here in a minute, but I've got copies of the book here, and you can find these on Amazon, where this was the #1 new release in the category of comic book criticism, which is maybe, it sounds less impressive when I get into what category it was #1 in, but still.
I'm an attorney. Hopefully you don't need my services. But if you do want to check out my writing, it's coverprice.com. You just go to the CP content. So, we write about different comics, different things. Cap shows up quite frequently in my writing. So, thank you guys.
Thank you so much.